Mar Antanous, the saint who finds what we lose. In homes across Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, one name is whispered whenever something goes missing. A ring, a wallet, a set of keys, even a sense of peace. The words come almost instinctively. Ya Mar Antanous, rajali اللي راح. And somehow, what was lost returns. For generations, Arab Christians have turned to Mar Antanous, known to the world as Saint Anthony of Padua, the saint who helps people find what they've lost. But few stop to ask who he really was, how this tradition began, or how it became so deeply woven into Lebanese and Arab Christian life. The life of Saint Anthony of Padua. Saint Anthony of Padua was not born in Italy, as his title might suggest. His real name was Fernando Martin de Bulhois, and he was born in Lisbon, Portugal, in the year 1195. He grew up in a wealthy family, educated, privileged, and surrounded by comfort. But even as a young man, he was restless, drawn toward something deeper than status or inheritance. At 15, Fernando joined the Augustinian monks, dedicating himself to study and prayer. But soon, he felt called to a different path. He encountered the Franciscans, a new and radical order founded by Saint Francis of Assisi. They lived with nothing, walked barefoot, and preached among the poor. Fernando was inspired by their humility and simplicity. He left everything behind, joined them, and took the name Anthony, after Saint Anthony the Great, the Egyptian monk and father of monasticism. Anthony's dream was to become a missionary and die a martyr in Morocco. But destiny had other plans. When he arrived there, he fell severely ill and was forced to return home. On the journey back, a storm pushed his ship off course, and he landed in Sicily, then moved to Italy, where he spent the rest of his life as a preacher and teacher. The miracle of the lost book. The story that made Saint Anthony the patron of lost things began in a monastery in Bologna. He had a small book of Psalms, handwritten, full of his personal notes for teaching. One day, a young friar decided to leave the monastery and took Anthony's book with him. It was a serious loss, not only because books were precious, but because it carried years of his reflections and lessons. Anthony prayed that the book would be returned and that the young man would find his way back to faith. Days later, the friar reappeared, with the book in hand, asking forgiveness and rejoining the community. From then on, people began to believe that Saint Anthony had a special grace for recovering what is lost, not just objects, but people, faith, and purpose. This devotion spread rapidly through Europe and eventually across the world. The prayer became universal. Dear Saint Anthony, please come around. Something's lost and can't be found. The preacher who moved nations. While Saint Anthony is best known today for finding lost things, his real legacy lies in his voice. He was one of the greatest preachers of his age, fearless, eloquent, and deeply compassionate. In 1222, when a misunderstanding left no one prepared to give a sermon at an ordination, Anthony was asked to step forward. Reluctantly, he began to speak. The crowd was astonished. His words were powerful, his understanding of Scripture profound. From that day on, Anthony became one of the most respected and sought-after preachers in the Franciscan order. He spent the rest of his life traveling, teaching, and bringing people back to faith. He preached to the poor and to heretics, to nobles and outcasts alike. One legend tells of him preaching by the sea when people refused to listen, only for a school of fish to rise from the water and gather silently as he spoke. Another tells of a starving mule that bowed before the Eucharist rather than eat the food placed before it, a miracle that silenced Anthony's critics. Anthony died young, just 35 years old, on June 13, 1231, in Padua, Italy. He was canonized less than a year later, one of the fastest canonizations in church history. His relics are now enshrined in the Basilica of Saint Anthony in Padua, a pilgrimage site for millions. How Saint Anthony reached the Arab world. The devotion to Saint Anthony of Padua traveled with Catholic missionaries and communities across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. By the 1600s, his name had reached Lebanon, where it merged with an already ancient reverence for another Anthony, Saint Anthony the Great, Anطونيوس el-Kabir, the Egyptian monk considered the founder of monastic life. The Maronites, deeply monastic by tradition, already venerated Saint Anthony the Great through monasteries like Deir Mar Antanous, Qozhaya in the Qadisha Valley, one of the oldest monasteries in the Middle East, built into cliffs and caves. Over time, the Portuguese and Italian devotion to Anthony of Padua blended with this local reverence. Thus, Mar Antanous in Lebanon came to refer to both Anthony the Great, the hermit of silence and the mountains, Anthony of Padua, the preacher and miracle worker, the finder of what's lost. The result is something uniquely Lebanese, a synthesis of monastic tradition and popular devotion, a saint who is both universal and deeply local. Is it only a Lebanese thing? Not at all. The custom of asking Saint Anthony for help in finding lost things is found almost everywhere that Catholicism took root: Italy, Portugal, Spain, Brazil, Mexico, the Philippines, India, and many other places. In some countries, he's also considered the patron saint of sailors, travelers, and marriages. But in Lebanon and among Arab Christians, the devotion took on a distinct cultural intimacy. It left the church and entered the home. Instead of a formal prayer, it became a casual conversation, a whispered Mar Antanous in Arabic, in our dialect, between family members and generations. It is part of the rhythm of everyday life, not just religious practice. When a Lebanese mother prays for her lost jewelry or a student mutters a plea for a misplaced phone, they are carrying a centuries-old spiritual lineage, one that stretches from the deserts of Egypt to the hills of Qadisha, from Lisbon's monasteries to Beirut's apartment balconies. A saint of the everyday. What makes Saint Anthony remarkable is not only his miracles but his humanity. He didn't build empires or lead armies. He taught, he forgave, he searched. His life reminds us that holiness can be found in small acts, in patience, in faith, in kindness. That's why his devotion still resonates so deeply with the Arab world. In cultures marked by exile, loss, and resilience, a saint who finds speaks to something beyond objects. He represents the longing to recover what was taken, whether it's an heirloom, a homeland, or a sense of hope. Every time we whisper, Ya Mar Antanous rajali li rah, we aren't just asking for help finding our keys. We're keeping alive a bridge between centuries, between lands, and between two Anthonies, the monk of the mountains and the friar of Padua, who both believed that nothing lost is ever truly gone. Legacy. Saint Anthony's story endures because it captures a universal truth. That faith often begins in the smallest moments, in loss, in confusion, in reaching for something unseen. For Arab Christians, Mar Antanous is more than a saint. He's a companion in everyday life. His story crosses geography, language, and denomination, proof that faith can travel, adapt, and find new homes while keeping its soul intact. He began in Portugal, he preached in Italy, and somehow his name now lives in the mouths of Lebanese mothers, Palestinian grandmothers, and Syriac monks in the mountains. 800 years later, he still answers to the same name, Mar Antanous, the saint who finds what we lose.